Welcome to BioIT World's Trends from the Trenches podcast, your insider's look at the science, technology, and executive trends driving the life sciences. I'm Allison Proffitt, editor of BioIT World. This episode is hosted by Stan Gloss, founder of BioTeam, a life sciences IT consulting company at the intersection of science, data, and technology. Joining Stan today is Howard Jacob, Vice President of Genomics Research at AbbVie. It's been 15 years since Howard made history at the Medical College of Wisconsin when he and his team first used genomic sequencing to save a patient's life. Now we are all living in the future he glimpsed then. He and Stan discuss AbbVie's R&D Convergence Hub, ARCH, for rare diseases, and the new data challenges facing us today. Let's listen in.
Well, good morning, Howard. I am so excited to finally have this conversation with you. I've seen you speak a couple times at Lab of the Future, and also I've seen Brian Martin from your organization speak a number of times at BioIT World. And if you haven't heard either Howard or Brian speak, you should kind of look for those presentations, and maybe the organizers of BioIT World can plug a couple of those presentations. But from those presentations, I have been so impressed by the work that AbbVie is doing in the area of data management. So I'd like to cover that today, but maybe we can start, Howard, by telling our audience a little bit about your background and how you got to AbbVie.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to take a long story and cut it quite short. So I started my pharmaceutical world at Abbott Laboratories, which at AbbVie is a spin-out, in 1981 as an undergrad working in the summers. And then after that, I became interested in pharmacology, went to get my PhD in pharmacology, postdoc at Harvard, MIT, and Stanford with Victor Zhao and Eric Lander. And then I was in academia for 30 years. So the irony that I came back to where I started is not lost on some of my colleagues around here. So apparently it was a destiny. So I got here. I'd been doing genomics in academia for 30 years, as I mentioned, working on the human genome. In 2010, we sequenced the first patient, found a cure for him, Nick Volker, which changed my world and made me think about how do we change medicine? How do we make a blueprint for every human instead of treating people on average? So I tried a few startups, couldn't get any pickup on top of that. And AbbVie said, hey, why don't you come here? We want to bring in at least 1 million genomes. So that's how I got here. I was like, wow, I'm never going to be able to get 1 million genomes of data in academics. So I've been here 6.5 years. So that's how I got to AbbVie.
Wow, that's an amazing journey. So I'm curious, when you arrived on the scene at AbbVie, what was the state of data? And 6 years ago, where were you at 6 years ago? Take us back in time a little bit.
Yeah, 6 years ago, I got here and, again, coming in from academia, I was blown away by the amount of data. I mean, I've been, on the advisory board for the Human Genome Sequencing Program, and I thought this was just big data. And it is, of course. But I was stunned at the amount of data that was floating around inside AbbVie. And, it was Abbott data before they spun out AbbVie. So, there's decades and decades of data laying around. Digitalization, you can argue when did that really start? So that's, depends on which group, digitalized sooner. But it was also clear that while we had a lot of data, we weren't using the data in a way that we maybe should have. And I started asking questions about, well, why? What are we doing with all this data? I mean, it seems to me we could be able to do more.
So a lot of the clients I speak to still have issues around the siloing and the attitude around data as my data versus our data. Did you encounter any of that when you first arrived?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I did. I think it goes back to how we're all trained, right? As scientists, we're trained to be accountable for our science, for what we do. Uh, Pretty much every scientist thinks they're the best scientist. And so, there's that bias of how we're all trained. And coming from academia, I've always been a free the data guy, and a lot of people aren't in academia. So I was kind of surprised, actually, that inside a pharma company, it was my data when, we don't raise the money in academia like we do in academia. We're all, rowing in the same boat. So why is it my data? And now, 6.5 years later, it's just become clear to me. It's that sense of ownership in how we're all trained, and we think we do the best, and it makes everybody a little bit nervous. Somebody else goes in and analyzes my data. I think some of it's that uncomfort, right? It's like, well, what if they find something that I didn't find, right? We look at that as a potential negative instead of a potential positive, right? One, you hope they validate your data if they relook at it. So that's great. Validation of science is always viewed as a positive. And geez, if we made a mistake, wouldn't that be great to find that out? But that's just again, I think it goes all the way back to the training days. I think we're still training people to really think about my data and my stuff and how good am I versus when you get out in the real world, it's team everything. Even in academia, it's team everything. So I think we have to train, the next generation of scientists to realize it's our data. It's not my data.
So what was the moment in time, perhaps, when the organization said, we have to do something about this? What was the trigger point that says we're going to have to spend money and time because you've already established we don't have value?
Yeah. So it goes back to Tom Hudson. He and I were both postdocs with Eric Lander. Tom was the head of, became the chief scientific officer at AbbVie, and really started asking questions around data, and was doing an offsite, bringing the R&D leadership team together and saying it was his first offsite, and he had pulled together a group of us before and said, hey, I want to talk about data. What's our data strategy? And it was no more than that. I mean, it was a blank piece of paper. And, with, I think there's 4 or 5 of us that he asked us to put together a workshop. And so it was really, that was the beginning of this. And as we started drilling into this, Phil Heiduck, who leads our information research group, who reports, Brian Martin reports to Phil, was really driving a lot of, and knew where all the silos were, knew where all the data was. And a few other people got together from development, discovery, and basically put on a little workshop of what could be. And there was a lot of skepticism. How fast are we going to be able to do this? How long is this going to take? Is this really where we should be spending our money now? There's so many things we need to be able to do. As with most pharma companies, you have so many clinical trials you're trying to get through. And do we really need to stop and worry about old data? I would say was one of the big issues. Everybody could say, sure, going forward, that's a really good idea, but not now, right? I mean, I think that's a common thing. Of course we have to do this, but not now, right? I got to get through this next quarter. I got to get through this next thing I got to get done because, it's not like no one's sitting around doing something. So you always have that conflict. So that's where it started. I'd say the overall workshop was met with lukewarm enthusiasm. Tom thought it was great. Those of us that had worked on it for a while thought it was great. But I think a lot of leaders, VPs, were saying, "Yeah, I think it's okay," but I'm not sure this is where we need to go. So Tom then pulled together 11 VPs and said, "Okay, go figure this out." And it was a white piece of paper. Now, having recently come in from academia, I've had white pieces of paper before, but I don't think in pharma very often do you get a white piece of paper. And so that created some challenges for us. But I think the advantage of that is that we had to figure out what we were going to do with the white piece of paper. So the 11 of us spent, it must have been almost a year and a half meeting, sometimes weekly, for sure, at least twice a month. We were in front of the R&D Leadership Team almost every month, asking, what are we doing? Where are we going? So there's a huge back and forth. It was a long year and a half, I'll tell you. And I wasn't leading it at that point. I was just one of the VPs. But some of the brilliance that Tom had in this is he had all the major functional areas, all the therapeutic areas, and legal at the table at the beginning. And that, I think, has been a secret sauce of having legal at the table. Because when people would say, oh, no, we can't do that, legal wouldn't allow that, we then have somebody from legal saying, well, I think we can figure that out. And so, a lot of the, what would I call it, walls that we think existed were actually just because we didn't know what to do about it as scientists. We didn't know how to navigate that. So that's where it started. And I think that was pretty important to have that amount of work and to have senior leadership saying, no, we're going to do this and be involved. Every month we'd come back with an idea, I would say every month we'd get a little piece that they thought was a good idea. And then we'd go back and do it again. And I think that back and forth was, at the time it was not fun at all. But at the end of the day, I think that really set the foundation.
Well, it sounds like you were following an agile process of iterating through a problem till you got to a solution.
I wish I would have had that perspective at the time, Stan, but yeah, that's a great idea. That's not how it felt, but you're right. That's exactly what we were doing.
So now you've got this plan. I mean, a lot of times people have plans, and you have the commitment from the senior leadership to execute a plan. What about funding? And taking the time and effort and having the money behind it to actually execute the plan? Because sometimes I see plans, but they're not funded or they're not supported. So you got to marry those things somehow.
Yeah. So what we had done is we had pulled together a bunch of different resources, and so we ended up the data integration program internally is called Convergence. And we basically borrowed that term from a white paper that was put out quite a few years ago called Convergence. I think it was published around 2016. That really looked at how do we bring together all of the different types of sciences. It's not just pharmacology, but it's also development. It's patient recruitment. It's medical affairs. It's the whole thing. And the siloing that happened, I think, again, retrospectively looking at it, nobody was trying to build a silo. Everybody was just trying to figure out how to get their work done as we started digitalizing everything. So everybody was solving their own problem to do their own work. And so the idea of converging it seemed like a great idea, but then how do you really do it? And so Phil had worked with a guy by the name of Mark Ramsey, who had actually done data integration for GSK. And so we ended up bringing Mark on board with his team, and they really helped us drive that. And so that investment and Mark's experience and his team's experience about how do you do this was essential. If we had tried to do this from scratch, we'd still be trying to do this from scratch. We really needed somebody to come in and say, because, most of us are not data scientists. That's not what we do. We, of course, have data scientists, but no one's thought about how do we integrate that data. So that was an essential decision that was made. And it took us then right around a year to go from zero to having the beginning of what we call the ARCH, which is the AbbVie the AbbVie R&D Convergence Hub, or ARCH. where we were pulling together all of the data. And the preclinical data was pretty easy. Inside most pharma, they know where all the data is, so it's pretty easy to get that. It took us about another 18 months to develop a plan for how do we get the clinical data in. So again, having legal involved, Jay Carroll was from the legal group. He then brought in a group of associates, contract lawyers, and they went through 25,000 clinical trials, and they went through every single one. And came up with, could we do this? Could we not do this? And then created the benchmark. And the goal was that we can bring 80% of our clinical data over and be able to use that again in the arch and use it in a way that was appropriate, right? How do you do this? Protect patients' privacy, make sure we're not, getting down to individual data, making sure we're not doing stupid with data. And so those pieces then started bringing all of that together. So anyway, that was the beginning of this.
Right.
And it was back to the investment. So having Mark around and his team then was somebody we could pressure test against, and he could say, "Yeah, I don't think that's going to work well." And there were some things that we needed to do that we knew we'd end up having to change down the road. But at the time, you have to balance, getting people on board versus how do you change it down the road. And that was the beginning. It was really, and so we've been doing this now. Arch I would say it's really, Arch was launched 3 years ago. I know that for a fact because we just had our quarterly Arch meeting, and we had the 3-year anniversary of the 3-year birthday of Arch. So for the last 3 years, it's been in place, and it's just getting better and better and better as we get more people to buy into that integrated data allows you to do things that you couldn't before.
So I think I heard Brian mention a number of investment that Arch was, and it was a big investment in terms of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Invested in art. I don't know if you know the actual number, but could share it. But it was a sizable investment from what I've remember from the presentations.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Stan, it's hard to quantitate the money, and here's why. I'd say we probably have right around 30 people that are full-time FTEs working on Convergence, but there's hundreds of people working on it. There's hundreds and hundreds of users now. And so that was our goal originally, was could we build something that people wanted to work on? Could we develop a culture that people thought this was a good idea? There's plenty of people that still don't think it's a good idea. I mean, I'm not gonna pretend that everybody thinks that this is a great idea. But inherently it's gotten better and better by people committing their own time and effort, and therefore their intellectual capital, and suddenly their data is our data, right? It's exactly what you would hope for, right? It's that culture that these are folks that are seeing the benefit of having all this data that they can use. And I don't think it's a surprise to you. It's not a surprise to me. Most people aren't going back and rechecking anybody else's data. No one has time for that, which is what everybody worries about. It's about moving forward with all the data that you couldn't have moved forward with if you didn't have the data, right? It's everything that we had promised it would be. We haven't had any real problems with finding something we shouldn't have found, or somebody analyzing data and created a fragmentation between groups. None of that has happened. Because again, nobody has time to look backwards. And that had been my experience in making data public well before it was published. When I was in academia, it was always about, well, are you going to get scooped? And we always had a year lag time, right? So we get a year advantage. And I always said, if somebody beats us after a year, well, then shame on us. But the whole point of generating data is to make it available. I mean, that's science inherently. And so what people are learning is that the power of more and different ways of doing things and truthfully, other partners that you didn't know were doing something that you could work with has been extraordinary.
Yeah. So if I remember the story correctly from the presentations, you've made some really amazing discoveries around you leveraging Arch for rare disease, and things that were not visible before have come visible as a result of having this system in place. Is that true?
Yeah. Let me set the story, because what you said is accurate. But why we did it is probably wasn't captured well when you heard the presentations in terms of how we presented it. So we're not a rare disease company. So AbbVie doesn't do rare diseases. Now, I had been doing rare diseases before coming to AbbVie. And so the question is, how do you prove something, right? So you bring all this stuff in. And I think one of the challenges is when you have all this data, and you and I were chatting ahead of time, and we can come back to this later about, knowledge graphs and how do we use this, is you got to have use cases. And so you have this challenge of how do you know something's going to work?
Right.
How do you test that, right? So if you're doing really novel, well, then nobody's had the answer before. But if no one's had the answer before, then how do you trust it? And I think this is one of the challenges with all this extra new things you can do. And AI and machine learning is only making it worse, right? Because nobody trusts it, right? Everybody fixates on the hallucinations. So we needed a use case. So coincidentally, my former head football coach, I went to high school in this area, knew I was doing rare diseases. He had heard me give a talk when I was in academia, and had a relative. I can't get into a lot of details about that. Had a relative with a rare disease, and wanted to know if I could potentially help this individual. So long story short, ultimately, Phil and I, back to Phil from IR, we often do things on Saturday mornings, a little bit dorkish of us, but we kind of have our science time. And I said to Phil, I brought this case up, and I said, what if we use the Arch? Could we see if we could find a treatment for this individual? So we ran it through the Arch, and I was sitting there watching Phil work and asking him questions, and we're doing this online. And Phil's dancing through the Arch in the knowledge graphs. And in 4 hours, we had 2 potential drugs in the market that could potentially treat this individual. And the irony of this is that the off-target effect for both of these drugs was sufficient enough to hit the target that this individual had disease on. Wow. Now, we couldn't take that back to the patient. That's always my rule in working with patients, is we'll only work with your physician. But I've seen this happen many times, Stan, which is it's hard to get the physicians to do something with this because there's no clinical trials on it, and they don't want to necessarily do it. But that story then became something that we could share. We can share it publicly. We can share it internally. We can show how we got there. And that was a great story that people could understand, right? Here we have a disease. Here we have a genetic mutation. Here we have all the drugs that we know everything about. Here we have all the chemistry, the PK/PD, of all of these drugs that are out there. And we could ask a question on the knowledge graph of, could these drugs potentially be used? And we could now have the data on what's the safe dose, what's the dose that's in place. And again, in 4 hours. Now, you saw me do a video that was 45 seconds that, Phil then walked back through how you could do it if we had gone through knowing what the answer was. And again, you saw that. You saw how he clicked through in the demo of all the different data that was sitting there. But that use case then has been incredibly helpful for us to say, this is not esoteric. This is not, it's not something that won't work. It will work. And then what do you want to do with that? And so that's really helped us. And then we have many internal stories that I can't share with you, from looking from safety to efficacy to indications that are really starting to demonstrate that this darn thing works. and we're doing more with it than what we ever thought possible, which naturally then what happens is other people then want to get on board. Back to your question about investment, more people getting on board. Well, then, in some instances, the therapeutic areas or the functional areas are putting their resources onto the table. We've now come up with a working committee across the different groups to look at, well, which data sources do we buy now instead of every group doing their own. So all that is a result of people realizing that working together is better than working alone.
Well, it strikes me that you've kind of hit this point of being almost having a scientific cooperative. You think of back in the days of people like Cabot creameries, and some of the dairy farmers have banded together, put this together, and now they work as a cooperative team. So it really it sounds like almost like that. But one of the things that before we finish up, I wanted to touch on, you mentioned the sharing and engaging people in the organization. And I was struck by the strategy that you have at AbbVie for disseminating information that has been generated through Arch. And maybe you can share that with us.
Yeah. So one of the things we wanted to do was to get this information out there. So I have to give a little sidebar and then I'll walk back into it, Stan. So again, this is my first pharma company, so I can't speak for other pharma, but we have a managerial track and we have a science track. I don't think that's necessarily unusual between different pharma companies. And there had been an internal journal before called Aster. And so this is things like publishing chemistry and things like that, where you aren't going to be able to publish that necessarily. So we started the AbbVie Convergence Journal. And the whole point was to demonstrate how you could do this. And so that was a way that we could publish these internal results. As I mentioned to you, we can't share some of this stuff because it's too far ahead. Eventually it will be published as we publish trials and things like that. But how do people get credit for it now? So we do have this journal. It is peer reviewed internally. It counts towards towards your building your portfolio if you're on the science track. It really enables you to demonstrate value and show that it works. And again, there's nothing like a publication to convince your skeptics that maybe there's something there. And so that's really where it happens. We also do workshops internally now. We have an internal like an experimental biology meeting, and we have this in AbbVie. It's called the AbbVie Community of Science, and so we have a couple of these big meetings every year. And so we now go around and look at how many posters, how many talks are using convergence and trying to capture all that. And it's increasing. And so, of course, what people do is they say, well, where did you get this information? And people say the Arch. Then people say, oh, I'm kind of curious, even though, and we've had internal TV shows. So we have R&D TV. And so it started as Convergence TV. And this is one of Tom's ideas. I thought it was the worst idea in the history of the mankind, largely because I was responsible for this, which is we have a TV show about something we're building, right? So my idea of building, I don't mind building on a blank piece of paper, but I'd kind of like to have my head down while we figure this out. No, we're flying the plane with a TV show talking about what are we doing on convergence. So people were watching this get built at the same time. And so all those things together, the hardest part of this is not integrating the data, it's the culture. That's the hard part. And the other part that is really hard is people trusting data that's not theirs.
Right.
Why would I trust somebody else's data? We've been taught not to do that. So suddenly you're bringing in all these different things. You have these different data you don't know what to do with. It's being analyzed with algorithms you don't understand, and you're being asked to make decisions on it. And so I think that most companies are going to struggle with the culture side, and they got to bite into that. I think everybody knows about the technical problems, but it's the culture that is the driver. And that's something that Mark had told us and the Convergence article said. So that's where we are, Stan. That's how we got here down the road.
Well, this has been fantastic, and I actually think you've just set up our next talk, which maybe we can just do a follow-up on this, just on culture, because it is all about the culture, integrating people, technology and processes. Technology and processes are easy. It's it's the integration of the people that really needs to do it.
Absolutely.
Well, so thank you so much for your time, and thank you for sharing your story with us. And we'll get back and maybe we'll plan another session to dig deeper into that culture piece.
Sounds great. Stan, thank you so much for your time, and thank you to the audience who's listening.
Thank you for listening to BioIT World's Trends from the Trenches podcast.